What hole am I going to dig myself into today? This is a subject that I've wanted to talk about for a while. I'll probably actually talk about it quite a lot, but I'm not really gone into detail on video. And I have a problem with single make racing. It's quite personal to me, but I'd like to go into detail why I kind of think it sucks, isn't that great, and there's a few issues with it that people often complain about when they go racing, and I want to sort of go into detail as why they're inherent to single make racing, right? So the first point I want to make is that I know some of my points can contradict each other sometimes. So if you're really into that sort of thing, I'm sure you can pick it apart. And the kind of complaints that I have really only affect mid to top level kart racing. They don't really affect the sort of basic IKR type club racing. And I understand, first of all, I understand why single make works for most people when they go karting. The benefits that it allows, certainly in maybe the relative reliability of the engines when we move away from race bred engines. So I do understand why they work for a lot of people, but for me, there's a lot of problems with them that I think kind of have an invisible kind of effect on the sport that's hard to quantify, particularly culturally. So yeah, what's the first issue that I have? Okay, so that is captive market, right? So when you buy into your particular class, whether it be Rotax, TKM, X30, you're captive to that class for a long period of time. So if you invest in TKM or Rotax or X30, whoever's the distributor in the world or runs the class, you are stuck with them for at least probably a year, maybe two. Okay, so you've made the initial purchase cost, and then that's it, you're in. And what tends to happen, once people invest in a class, they tend to stick with it, okay? It's similar to kind of the sunk cost fallacy in a way that, once you've spent the money, you're married to what you've spent it to, no matter what happens, right? So as a manufacturer, now I'm not accusing directly these manufacturers of these practices. These are the kind of things that I think people need to be wary of and need to be aware of when they buy into these kind of racing systems, right? So particularly in single make racing where it's engine based, so it's single make engines where as a customer you buy the engine, and that's the one engine that every competitor in the class has to race, right? And you're always buying it from one single distributor. Okay, they're the ones that distribute the engines. They tend to control the class. Okay, so my issue is that you're captive to any updates that the manufacturer might feel is needed. That tends to happen every couple of years. Most notably, I think the Evo product from Rotax was the big update package that I think is one of the biggest update packages you'll ever see in a kind of single make class concept. Other updates include improved tooling. Maybe they change the way they manufacture the barrel. Okay, and you'll find over time that even though you're in a single make product, single make class, within that you have layers of like, this is a X series barrel, this is a D series barrel, or the electronics are this set of electronics from this year, and blah blah blah. You get the idea. So even though you buy into a single make product, a single make class, you're still having to deal with upgrades and updates that quite often will improve performance. They tend to be sold as improving parity between engines, but ever since the single make class came out, manufacturers always herald how fair it is, how equal the engines are, but they still tend to find a way to improve the parity every couple of years. So and coincidentally they tend to nudge the performance a little. So that's something to be very careful of. It's not a slight against the sort of racing, it's more me telling people to be wary of when you buy into a class that sells itself as being fair racing, just look at over the years how many times they upgrade the package and update the package. You know, if they were 10 years ago saying it was super fair racing, and now are saying we're going to make it even fairer, it's a bit of a red flag. So that's the first point I wanted to make. Is it a slight against the class? I don't know, but I think it's more of a philosophy, really. So it's like you're being sold that it's fair racing. Is it really? I don't know. And that leads me on to my second point, which is, and this mainly affects classes where there's no claiming rule. I think in Super 1, the way John Hoyle regulates it is that I think any engine can be bought for £2,000, right? So this kind of mitigates to a certain extent this kind of problem, though doesn't exactly remove it because there are loopholes. So monopolisation of performance. Okay, so when you race a particular class that says in the regulations that you have to buy this spec of engine from this manufacturer, that tends to be the case that within technical regulations you can't actually machine any of the components and you can't add material. So basically they have to be raced as they came out of the factory. And what this does is it allows people to kind of buy, literally they will buy hundreds of engines and they will basically find a good one, whether it means mixing and matching and that kind of thing. Because you can't tune it, you can't blueprint it. You have to then, if you can't blueprint or tune, then you just have to buy a ton of engines to find one that works really well. Okay, one that sort of is at the limit of the fiche here and the limit of the fiche here. So because there's obviously differences in manufacturing, you know, it doesn't matter how good the tools are, and I know they've improved over time. There's always going to be differences. So what happens is you get this thing where people buy hundreds of engines, they'll find 2 or 3 really good ones that are different, that I've seen the dynos and I've been involved in it. They'll find the good engines and that's it. They've got them, then they hoard them, right? And sell the rest, right? And if you're one of those people that can afford that practice, because it is excessively expensive to do this, you can still sell the engines and make some of your money back, even make a bit of a profit. You've still got a system where someone can buy a ton of engines, find a good one, and then they can keep those engines for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And you're, as a competitor, you can't ever compete with them because you haven't got the resources to buy 10, 20, 30 engines to find a good one, right? So this is a practice that goes on, and it means that you end up getting engines that hit the market for 10 grand, 15 grand sometimes. Those engines that sort of spend happens when a class becomes very popular. This is kind of something that I wanted to address. Classes are really fair. You'll notice that people say they can win with an out-of-the-box engine all the time when the classes are relatively small. But once those big spenders come in, you see that sort of split happen. So as a competitor, you can't compete with that kind of racing because you can't tune your engine, you can't even blueprint it. There was a case a number of years ago in TK, I believe, where an engine tuner was basically blueprinting engines, which is illegal, but he was doing it in a manner which a scrutineer couldn't tell that any of the engine had been machined, right? So he actually wasn't making the engines illegal in the sense they were outside of particular limitations. It was that you aren't allowed to blueprint the engine, and it's kind of a funny one because, like I said, the engine wasn't illegal if you measured it. The actual practice of making it look like the engine had just come out of the factory was, but so it was cheating, but at the same time, all this person was doing was blueprinting an engine so someone could buy an engine from the manufacturer and have it relatively as good as it could be in theory, outside of the tuning sort of rules. So that's another point I wanted to make. So yeah, monopolisation of performance. We see big spend on engines. You know, you always hear paddock rumours of engines going for 10, 15 grand. So it's kind of symptomatic of a system where you have a single make and everyone has to race the same engine year on year on year. You know, you ain't got tuners that are coming in doing little bits to catch up with someone who's quick at a particular point in time. So someone that can do it can monopolise the performance for an extended period of time. Okay, so my next point is leads on from the last point, and that is fairness is kind of it's bullcrap in my view. I think I get a lot of stick for saying something like this, but I believe that the concept of fairness in racing is a selling point which is inherently misleading. Racing isn't fair, and when you say it's fair, you do an injustice to those that race and don't finish inside the top three, but are kind of, you know, hauling around a dog of an engine, right? Let me explain this. Okay, so in a single make grid, let's call it Formula Dove, right? So I'm the engine supplier. You're all racing my engines, right? And I'm saying that these engines are all really close, right? Even though probably there are differences between the engine, right? So if you got, you know, little Johnny, who's lad and dad team, and he's got one engine, and it's a heap of crap, right? And he's finishing maybe in the top 10, right? And, you know, you got your good kids at the front, and they're winning the races, right? So on paper, he's the 10th quickest guy. Because I'm telling everybody, this is fair racing. So if you're 10th, it means you're 10th. As a driver, that's it. You're the 10th best, and that's it, right? Now I know, as the person that knows the engines, probably thinks, well, that ain't really true. I know this kid's actually really good, and the engine that he's got, he should be finishing 15th and 20th, right? So as a competitor, if you're doing something really special on something that's not that good, no one can really spot it. No one can appreciate it, and no one can say, do you know what, this kid is really good. I mean, unless you've really got a good eye for it, right? So Why do I think that maybe multi-manufacturer racing, old school kind of racing, is better in this regard? So I'll go back to 2007, right, when Casey Stoner, so I'm going to talk about bikes for a little bit, when Casey Stoner won the championship on a Ducati, right? Now, he had the best engine, but that bike was clearly not the best bike. So his success on that bike was more remarkable than had he won on a Honda or a Yamaha, right? It exemplified his talent because it was quite obvious that the Ducati wasn't the best bike, because you could see that he was finishing 15-20 seconds ahead of the next Ducati rider, right? So you have a type of racing that is inherently unfair because Casey Stoner had to ride a bike that was demonstrably less good than everybody else. Okay, so you might say the tyres, the bridge stones, blah, 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 if you're into your motorbikes. But that's kind of something quite good about that kind of racing, that you can have these debates. But so if we revert that back to karting, if you have a grid and, you know, you've got the top kids, so then we go back maybe, I don't know, 30 years, right, 35 years, and you've got a kid who's on a dog slow Hewland Arrow 100cc engine, right, and he's, you know, hitting the podium or fifth, right, and he's up against people on IMEs and like maybe other engines that are the top engines at the time, but he's got something that we all look at and go, we know that's slow, we know it don't work all that well, right, and he's finishing third or third, you know, maybe third, fourth, fifth. As a driver, his position, which is fifth, sixth, third, fourth, is worth more as a competitor because you know that they're not on amazing pieces of kit. So in a sense, fair racing does an injustice to those who can't afford good equipment, because their good performances are hidden Whereas if you're in a class where you know that person isn't on the best gear because visually it's obvious, those performances where they don't have to win for their performances to be exemplary and to be demonstrably exemplary. Okay, they're obvious to everybody. So it's a bit of a weird kind of way of looking at racing, but the way I see it is multi-manufacturer racing. If it's designed in a particular fashion, you can have drivers that don't win, but you still notice them. In single make competition, if you don't win, no one gives a toss. So weirdly, it's the opposite of what you might perceive when you observe a race. Okay, so what's my next point? Okay, so if we're talking about karting as a motorsport, a lot of this maybe on my part is utopian thinking, I guess. So it's like what my ideal version of the sport would be, I guess. But single make racing reduces the incentive for manufacturers or teams to hire good drivers, especially with classes where it's single make engines and chassis, like a combined thing. Because when you have that, what's the incentive for a driver to be hired or to have their kit provided for free or anything like that? And that I think that's something in the sport where, single make racing, it puts all of the incentive of spending onto the competitor. There's no, relatively speaking, there's less opportunity for professional opportunities to happen. They still are there, but there's less so now. So I think if we look at motocross, KTM have to hire the best riders in to win the Supercross so they can sell bikes and promote their brand, right? But if you're racing a single make series, bar maybe where you've got multi-manufacturer chassis still available, which is still widespread in the sport, but there's a kind of homogenisation with chassis, so there's less difference now. There's not really any incentive to hire someone to go race X30 or Rotax in the UK. There's no point, because if I'm a Rotax dealer, why do I want to pay someone to race Rotax? Because come rain or shine, a Rotax is going to win the race. So I've got no real incentive to hire anybody to race. They're still kind of there because people try and sell chassis, but from an engine point of view, there's no incentive. So I think from a kind of a utopian view of the sport, where I'd like there to be opportunities for drivers who are brilliant to have a way to professionalise what they do. When there's single make racing is so dominant, there's less incentive. Okay, so yeah, that's something that I'm not a huge fan of from a single make racing point of view. Okay, so my next point is, I think this is kind of, again, some of my points can be a bit weird. I think this single make racing culture, I don't know, I feel like karting culture has died somewhat. The vibrancy that you have with multi-manufacturer racing, so I guess I'm presenting multi-manufacturer racing as an alternative. I think there's a less vibrant culture, and by that I mean, from a media perspective, single make racing, the reason I don't really report on racing is, and it sounds harsh, it's incredibly dull. It's incredibly dull. And I know that sounds harsh on the competitors that race, but if you're turning up to a meeting and it's the same engines racing and there's nothing to talk about, there's low stories, it's basically a spreadsheet fulfillment system. It's you put in the input and this is the output. There's very little stories to talk about. There's less rivalry between tuners. I mean, technically you have service agents and people that rebuild the engine, but there's not tuning. There's not there's not manufacturers trying to kill each other, trying to beat each other, trying to destroy each other. It's just you turn up, the same engines win because everyone's racing the same stuff, and you go home and that's it. And there's sort of, I don't think the driving standards are less as such, but yeah, there's just less story. There's less of a story, and culturally, I think for the sport, it's lesser for it. You know, like you might flick through old karting magazines and find, you know, the new homologation of engines. You know, and people are trying different things, and it's really interesting to talk about and to test and to get excited about. You know, who's going to be racing with who's going to be trying what, and the incentive for the manufacturers is to win. Again, it's very difficult to describe, but from a media perspective, you know, which I guess I am, and I'm less so nowadays. Single make racing, I'm afraid, is incredibly dull, and I know a lot of people see karting as a way to show off talent, but I don't think it does a better job of showing off talent either, because like I've described earlier, with how talent can be hidden within single make racing, because we assume that all the engines are the same. You know, I think cognitively, if you're having to test different engines and provide different feedback for the tuner and get involved on that on a technical level, it's more demanding from a driving perspective. So, I don't know. The racing is less electric. It's you know, if you watch any kind of multi-manufacturer competition where you've got the drivers and then you've got the tuners and the teams, and it's so much more vibrant and colourful and interesting, you know. And there are times when engine manufacturers come out of the blue and they release an engine that's like totally different to everybody else, and it doesn't work, but who cares? It's cool. So yeah, from a vibrancy standpoint, single make racing is so dull. You only have to look at bike racing. You know, everybody watches MotoGP. No one's going to be watching the R6 Cup. Everybody watches F1. Not many people are watching Formula 4 and any other, you know, homogenous single-seater series where it's just everybody's in the same and talent wins. Bollocks. The talent doesn't win in the end with single-make competition, because who cares who's talented when you all have to race the same stuff anyway? There's no incentive to hire anybody. There's no incentive to hire talented drivers to show off your gear, to show off why your engine is the best, you know? So single make racing is dull, and I think it crushes talent, weirdly. So that's another point. Another point. So I guess multi-manufacturer competition is my alternative, and I know this is a utopian idea. Really, this is not realistic, but for me, multi-manufacturer competition, the engines are racing engines, you know, and as a competitor, you can feel that when you drive. TKMs, Rotaxes, you know, X30s, Leopards, you know, in their own right, sometimes can be quite fun to drive, but they're a bit soft, and they're not quite on edge like with a proper race engine. You know, like I'm a fan of hundreds, right? And you can, you know, they're on edge all the time, and as a driver, the experience is so much more, because you're not just set with an engine all year. You've got options, you can try different things, you're always more intense because you've got a different carb to try, you've got a different engine to try, maybe your tuner has tuned the engine a particular way for a particular circuit and you need to make most of it here and here and here. It's just more vibrant, more interesting, more challenging as a competitor. And when you get it right, multi-manufacturer, when the technical specs are right, because I think with single make competition, and even with modern versions of multi-manufacturer racing, they tend to have rev limiters and stuff like that, and they kind of weirdly, they lock in the performance differentiation between engines. So take as an example, say I have a Rotax, right, and it's a medium level Rotax. The performance is locked in. I can't take any risks with that engine. I can't really lean it off. It doesn't really work. I can't bolt on a massive sprocket because the thing dies after 14,000 RPM, and that's set within the manufacturing, within the engineering of the engine, right? But if I'm racing this thing here, you know, I'm having a bit of a dog of a weekend, I can go, do you know what? I'm going to put on an extra couple of teeth. Let's risk it. Let's see what happens. You know, so from a competitor point of view, even though, you know, there is that extra stress of different engines, you also have more freedom to catch up with the performance loss against competition. You know, there was a few years ago, this is a long time ago, I think it was Richard Bradley won Shennington Formula A in the British Championship, and everybody was on TMs and he was on an IAME, right? And Shennington with hundreds, it's a bit airy, right? Because you're at the top end of your RPM quite a lot, and they're all seasoned, right? Everyone's seasoned, bang, 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 and then he ends up winning. I think the top 4 season, he ends up winning because he was on IAME, and the IAMEs didn't have quite the performance of the GFR tuned TMs, but they were a tad more reliable at the time. And it was interesting that from a competitor point of view, you could make the choice to go, I'm going to maybe be a bit safe, not risk it, go with this engine, let them take the risk. They might have extra performance, but I might end up winning it in the end. So from a performance perspective, and it works best with engines without, I believe, without rev limiters. You need that option to just go to the sky and just like absolutely risk everything, you know, or not, you know. So from my perspective, multi-manufacturer competition, if the technical regulations are written correctly, weirdly enough, can kind of create better racing and give opportunities that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. Because if you're stuck with a dog slow single make engine, you're stuck with a dog slow single make engine. Ain't nothing you can do about it. But if you're with something like this, you know, you could maybe take it to a tuner and they can fix it. And in the end, the difference between hundreds Formula A's was tiny. I remember speaking to a works driver and he was saying, you know, we're finding vanishingly small differences between engines in the end. So, you know, that to me, weirdly enough, is you can have a system with tons of different manufacturers, but if the technical regulations are simple, essentially simple, you can sort of get that parity of performance via a means which is counterintuitive. Now, I must admit at this point, I mean, I've been talking for nearly half an hour here, but, you know, KF really, like, fucked it all up. When they, I mean, by then, multi-manufacturer racing was dead anyway, because road tax happened and TK. I mean, like, you know, I'm doing a diatribe here against single make racing, but I'm not going to sit here and say that it don't work for competitors. You know, I'm going after the extremes of it, the things that I find problematic. But yeah, multi-manufacturer racing doesn't have ambassadors, promoters, so partly the reason why it started to die off. What, you know, of course you can't, you know, if on the face of it, no one wants to be replacing pistons every hour compared to like what road tax and all that was doing at the time, even though in reality people rebuild these single make engines a lot more frequently than you realise to actually keep them in peak performance. So yeah, KF is an example of how you can take multi-manufacturer competition and really fuck it up, because you add in any layers of complexity and yes, it can become very troublesome, very expensive very quickly. So it's not to say that multi-manufacturer racing is inherently the answer, because it can actually end up costing a whole lot more. KF was a disaster, so I admit that. And even though I ended up in 2011 racing at the British Champs, and that ended up badly for me because I ended up with a written off car and a broken hand. But yeah, that's that. You know. Next point. Well, one more thing about that British Championship. What was brilliant about multi-manufacturer competition over single make is I could go to Bob Astle at Karting and say, look, I want to promote the British Championship. I want to promote this type of racing. You're the Maxter guy. You're a tuner. Let's do a deal. And he ended up lending me a couple of engines for the championship, which was like amazing opportunity for someone like me. I wasn't fast in any sense of the word, but you know, this type of competition where you have tuners that you're all about winning and showing off your product that you're selling. You get it a little bit with single make, but it ain't like having your own freaking manufacturing deal that you want to sell this engine. You know, it doesn't compete with that kind of thing. So that was great. I could team up with him and he could lend me the engines and I could go race and say, look, Maxter KF Mint, let's do it, you know. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in before I forgot. So yeah, next point. With single make racing, what tends to be the case, and this is sort of good for those who buy the engine, not so good. No, it's good if you want to sell, not so good if you want to buy. In multi-make, in single make racing, engines tend to keep their value. So if you look at a sealed Evo, right, you won't be able to get one for less than maybe a full Evo engine, right? For less than maybe, you know, $1,000 really. So because single make racing, the engine always remains relevant with reference to competition. They tend to keep their value quite well, which is great if you're selling. But if you're coming into the sport, it can be a bit more difficult. You know, so isn't it to sort of explain this? An Evo engine maybe will sell for $1,000, but a Prevo engine, pre-Evo, you know, you can pick those up for like 350, 400 quid now. So, and they're not kind of relevant engines anymore to modern Rotax racing. So, with multi, and it's similar with multi-manufacturer racing in that once the season's done and people are investing in new engines for the year, the market for second-hand engines, especially with engines that are like these, that rev their nuts off and stuff, they aren't particularly reliable. They don't have many components. I say reliable, the pistons don't last for a long time. Reliability, they're reliably going to slow down after an hour and a half, so it depends how you frame the question. But the market for hundreds tended to be, they depreciate a little bit more because the engines were a little less relevant as the years went by. So like a 2-year-old, 3-year-old 100, you might race that in 100 Britain or 100C, you know, tended to depreciate quite hard. KFs nowadays, because they're completely irrelevant, you can pick them up for a few hundred quid. So in some way, though it's not 100, I can't say it's 100% truthful because I can't sit here and show you a graph. Single make racing, the engines tend to maintain their value. You can see that as a positive or a negative, but I think depreciation is a good thing because it can encourage new people into the sport because they don't have to invest so much to purchase gear. I mean, and also I think psychologically, I think it's healthier because when someone comes into the sport, I think I tend to find this anecdotally now, they get very quickly disappointed when they find out that the single make concept that they've bought into isn't all that it seems. So they're sold fair racing, everyone's got the same engine. They soon find out that's bullshit and they have to either leave the sport or come to terms with it and end up spending a lot of money because they immediately feel like they have to have the best engine, where if you've got a sport that the engines do depreciate, they are recognisably less relevant to the middle to the top level aspects of the sport. You know, you come into the sport and your expectations are more realistic. You know, you've spent less on an engine, you visually know that the top guys are on a new homologation, so you know your engine's probably a generation old, so your expectations are different. And I think that's a healthier way to go racing. I think it encourages people to spend less money initially because they're not feeling like they've been conned or anything like that, and they can just get their novices races out of the way and then get into it, maybe find a tuner, develop a relationship and get going that way. There's a certain level of utopianness to this, I do recognise. So, but why not? Why not be like that? I think for me, I think that's just a healthier way to temper expectations. Okay, so I've got a few more points, but thanks for staying with me. Now, got two more points. Okay, so is arrive and drive the answer? Because there's two ways to look at this. I often berate single make racing and then say, you know, multi-manufacturer racing's the answer. It's not necessarily the answer for everybody, but in my vision, that's what I kind of like to see. That it offers so many more opportunities for drivers and for the sport and for the people like me from a media perspective to talk about stuff, right? Because I just get so bored of single make racing, right? It's dull, really dull. And you know, I like some of the engines are good, but like I said, it can be really boring. So I'm at that end of the spectrum. Other people are like, you know, maybe we should make it all arrive and drive, and there's a validity to that, but I think it castrates the sport so much that it becomes even duller than it is sort of now. So I think that's a bit harsh. It's not super dull, but for me sometimes it can be. So I think the arrive and drive stuff is good for those that do it, but it is, to me, even though it might cure to some extent this kind of disparity between engines, I think it kills off so much you expect from a driver, the savagery, the work ethic, the kind of the multi-manufacturer, just it breeds a different mentality. In single make racing, I ain't no communist, so I don't know. It just doesn't, from my perspective, it's just bereft of anything interesting. It's like the engines, the classes tend to be, they detune them quite heavily because if they're too fast, you know, the maintenance costs are too high. You know, we've seen in the past when people try and do high performance arrive and drive stuff, it's ripe for sort of people getting exploited financially. So yeah, I don't like arrive and drive all that much. It's kind of alright for charity events and stuff, but it ain't no motorsport. So I guess to finish off, I know that you're saying, well, okay, what competitions do we have? What engines do we have now that could be kind of cool? You know, I kind of like the Col de Sur product from IME. If that was multi-mag, that'd be quite interesting. So that's like a direct drive 175 thing. But yeah, Sudam, that's a great engine formula. That's kind of like ICA with 125 instead of 100, so you're not revving so high. The OK product, after KF, you know, royally fucked up CIK level racing, killed off national racing, like, OK was a step forward. I know Kees van der Grint, who was basically pivotal in getting that class developed. And there were compromises like the power valve and the rev limiter, which I fucking hate. There's nothing worse than... I mean, I've got to say, okay, so I've got to be open. I've never driven an OK, but I've done KF stuff, and you only have to see visually. Once it hits the rev limiter, the car just stops. It's horrible. So I don't like that. But the things are brutally quick. But I just think in a development cycle that the improvements that manufacturers are finding, like with KF, it's just a little bit too much complexity. But I think it's kind of interesting. I am actually speaking to more people in the paddock that are kind of attracted to it. I think, you know, there's a couple of teams that have engines that they use for tests and stuff. It worked here in the UK when they made it single make, funnily enough, and they said it'd only be vortexes, but I think that was partly because there was kind of a subsidy on it. It wasn't realistic, the amount the engines were being rented for. So I don't know if there is an answer. I don't know if... Certainly the market isn't going to go that way. I'm 100% realistic. We're not going to end up like motocross or anything like that. And I know there are problems with multi-manufacturer racing that heralded the era of single make, but you know, OK, senior OKs is all right. They're fast, they're interesting. I would prefer them to go back to Formula A and there to be a different culture and to be... I think really what needs to change is not so much the formulas, but the ambassadors for that type of racing just don't exist. You know, even... You know, when we had Super One and they were running the British Championships, it's unrealistic to expect someone like John Hoyle to say, fuck off doing your X30 or your Rotax, well, X30 then, but fuck off Rotax and TKM, do multi-manufacturer racing, this is the nuts. Because they're the main chunk of your business, you know. So, and the CIK or the FIA do a terrible job of even understanding their own sport. I think... you know, the manufacturers don't even sell it. You know, there's the odd thing of like, you know, we want to promote this sort of racing at national level because a lot of countries don't run CIK classes nationally now. So there's hints of it, but they're just so bureaucratic and dull. You know, you need a Tom Kutcher type character. You know, you need someone who owns a formula, like Formula One. I know compared to Formula One where the costs are astronomical, but at least you have a company that promotes Formula One. You know, Liberty or MotoGP has Dorna, and karting, you'd need someone that's able to promote it to a lot more competitors because of the nature of karting's competition. But yeah, it just, this sort of racing, it just doesn't have any ambassador. So that's problematic. It's one of the reasons it doesn't really exist anymore, because no one really cares about it. No, a lot of people don't even understand this type of racing exists in kart racing. So yeah, what product wise, I don't know, maybe okay. It's all that's left really, but I think maybe Sudam could work, but yeah, it's a tricky position now because culturally it's forgotten. It's a forgotten way of racing, especially nationally. So yeah, this video is very long today. I appreciate you watching it. If you are here at the end, make sure you comment below if you like or dislike anything I say. Of course, remember the Patreon page we've got, that's linked below if anyone wants to help pledge some money to help the channel. And yeah, thanks for watching.